Hi, and welcome to the next video of our course History of English, English and its Germanic relatives. In this video, we are going to focus on the Germanic relatives of English and the position of English among these relatives. The structure of this video is as follows. First, I will shortly discuss the sources that I use for this presentation. I'm going to talk about the extension and the different official status of the individual Germanic languages. I'm shortly going to discuss, partially recap something about their history. I'm going to mention the different writing systems used currently or historically to write down the Germanic languages. I'm going to talk about morphology, syntax, lexicon, and phonology of the individual Germanic languages. I'm not going to do a full-blown overview of these different aspects of all the different Germanic languages. That would be way too much for this short video. So I'm going to discuss some things that are some phenomena within these different aspects of the linguistic system of the Germanic languages, either things that differentiate Germanic languages from other non-Germanic languages, but also I'm going to focus on several things that make some of the Germanic languages unique and interesting to look at, even though that it's not necessarily a phenomenon or a feature that we know from English. Okay, so let's have a look at the sources. So I'm basically using these three books. First is the Germanic Languages by Eckhard König and Johann van der Auwera. That's a wonderful overview of the different Germanic languages. Probably not all of them, but pretty much all of them. There are 2 or 3 chapters on some of the historical stages of the Germanic languages, of English, but also of Proto-Germanic. And there is also a very nice chapter on Germanic, on Creole languages based on Germanic languages. Then there is a very similar text by Wayne Harbert, which is a bit more recent, but in all terms very similar to what Eckhard König and Johann van der Auwera put together. There is perhaps less focus on the historical parts. And then if you're interested in basically the early history of the Germanic languages, then a very nice book is Robinson's Old English and Its Closest Relatives, and I can only recommend it. The bibliography for these 3 books can be found in the list of references that I've uploaded on Blackboard, so feel free to have a look at these books if you want to learn something more than what I'm going to say in this video. Okay, that's it. And now let's have a look at what I've called extension and official status of the Germanic languages. So when we talk about when I talk about the Germanic relatives of English, what I basically mean is this. So there is a number of different languages that we subsume under the label Germanic, and one big group are the so-called Anglo-Frisian languages. That's English, Scots, and then the Frisian languages. I say Frisian languages because Frisian is basically an umbrella term for different varieties that are not mutually intelligible. And that is West Frisian, which is the official language of the province of Friesland in the Netherlands. Then there is North Frisian, spoken in northern Germany and southern Denmark. And then there is Sater Frisian or Saterland Frisian, which is a minority language spoken in Lower Saxony in Germany. But this is a very endangered language spoken by only several thousand people. Okay. And then there is this big group of other languages that are sometimes called Continental West Germanic. This is the most widely spoken language of this group is German or High German, then Dutch, Afrikaans, spoken in Southern Africa, then also Low German, a minority language spoken in northern parts of Germany, then Pennsylvania Dutch, spoken in the United States. The name of this language is a bit misleading because it has nothing to do with Dutch. It's a language based on German dialects, so it's not. It's only indirectly related to Dutch as spoken in the Netherlands. Pennsylvania Dutch is a variety, a Germanic variety that are spoken pretty much exclusively, although not exclusively, by religious minorities in Northern America or in the US. Then there is Yiddish, a language that was once spoken by around 13 million people in Europe and the United States, but is nowadays the language community of Yiddish has diminished in course of the Second World War, but it is still a language that is used in different countries around the world, in the United States and in Israel, probably most prominently. Then there is also Luxembourgish, one of the three official languages of Luxembourg. Okay, so these two groups, English, Scots, and the Frisian languages, with these languages that I've just discussed, can sometimes be also grouped together as the West Germanic languages. West Germanic languages are contrasted with the North Germanic languages, sometimes also called Scandinavian languages, but this is not a correct term because Scandinavian would also comprise Finnish, which is not a Germanic language. Okay, but in the North Germanic group, we have Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and when we speak about Norwegian, again, Norwegian is also an umbrella term for two varieties, Bokmål and Nynorsk. Bokmål is a Norwegian variety based on, or more closely related to, Danish, whereas Nynorsk is a variety based on Norwegian dialects. And then we have two insular North Germanic languages, Faroese, spoken in on the Faroese Island, part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and we have Icelandic, the language spoken in Iceland, is the official language of Iceland. Right. Then there are also other languages which are not in this list, and those are Creole Germanic languages, or Creole languages based on Germanic languages. And when we speak about Germanic languages, we basically mean three in this regard. The biggest group of Creoles are English-based, and they are really spoken all over the globe due to the colonial history of the English speakers and the spread of the English language. So we can find English-based Creoles in the Caribbean, in the United States, in Africa, and in on the islands of the Pacific Ocean. And you know by now probably Tok Pisin. There are also Dutch-based Creole languages, or I should probably say they were, because there were a number of Dutch-based Creole languages spoken in what was once the Dutch colonial empire in Indonesia and South America, but they are all basically not spoken anymore actively. And there were also a couple of German-based Creoles, or at least one is particularly relevant for the research of Creole languages, and that is the so-called Unserdeutsch, a German-based Creole that was spoken and that is still spoken by approximately 100 people in Papua New Guinea. Okay, then this is still not all. There are also other very small Germanic languages that are normally not included in the big overview of Germanic languages, and that is, on the one hand, Elfdalian, sometimes regarded as a dialect of Swedish, but sometimes also as a very, due to its very conservative traits, a standalone language. Then also the so-called Villamovian, which is also a language spoken by approximately 100 people in Silesia, in what is nowadays Poland, but what was a German-speaking territory before the Second World War. And this particular dialect is so distinct from the other dialects that it is considered to be also a different language. Okay, and then there are, of course, dead relatives, as you know. So the most important of these is Gothic, right? The one of the East Germanic languages. So we have West Germanic languages, right? We have North Germanic languages, and we have East Germanic languages. And that is most prominently Gothic, and its offspring Crimean Gothic that probably died out in the 17th, 18th century and was spoken on the Crimean Peninsula. Then there are the two other dead East Germanic languages, which is Burgundian and Vandalic, and then a dead North Germanic language, Norn, which was spoken on the British Isles before it was pushed out of the British Isles by Scots and English. Okay. As you can see, based on this map, Germanic languages are spoken all over the world, and there are different groupings of the status of the individual Germanic language in the different countries around the world. You can see this different status signalized by the different color of the countries on the map. So the deepest red refers to a country where a Germanic language is official and is the L1 of the majority of the population. Right? So it's the native language of most of the population, and it has an official status. Then there are other languages, other countries where a Germanic language is official, but it is not the L1 of the majority. So it is being used. It is being used perhaps by a minority or only in certain contexts, but nevertheless it has an official status. And then there are other countries where either in English, mostly English, but also other Germanic languages are recognized by the state to have some role in the society, or this language is spoken by a minority, but the language nevertheless has no official position in the country. Okay, So that was that. And now let's have a look at the history. So what made Germanic languages Germanic? And one of the things that I obviously have to mention is the so-called First Germanic Consonant Shift, also known as the Grimm's Law. We discussed this in one of the very early sessions of our seminar. So you might remember that this is a phonological process that took place in the first millennium BC, and it affected Proto-Indo-European consonants. And it affected them in the following way. So first, we have here the sounds p, t, k, and qu, which in the first wave of the Grimm's Law developed to the Germanic sounds f, th, ch, and ch. So if we compare it to an example, here is the Latin word pes, and Latin represents the pre-Grimm's Law situation. So the p in pes changed to f in foot. Similarly, the Latin word for three, tres, shifted to th, three, right? Then the shift of k to ch, we have the Latin word for dog, canis, shifted to a ch or h sound, hound. And the sound qu, right, shifted to the Germanic sound. So the qu shifted to ch, as we can see, for example, in the Latin word for what, quod, which is in English, obviously, what or what. Then after these consonants shifted, the b, d, and g shifted and took the place of p, t, k, which had shifted in the first wave. And again, following suit, these aspirated voiced stops shifted to and became the unaspirated voiced stops. Okay, so this phonological shift basically created, at least phonologically speaking, the identity of the Germanic languages as we know them nowadays. In some of the Germanic languages, another process happened, which is called the Second Germanic Consonant Shift. It's also sometimes referred to as the High German Consonant Shift, because the major area where this shift happened was in the High German speaking areas in southern Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And this is a process that took place several centuries after the Grimm's Law took place, somewhere between the 3rd and 5th centuries, probably until the 8th century AD. And it affected basically, first, there were again several things that happened. And the first thing that happened was that from the Proto-Germanic or West Germanic sounds p, t, k, we get the sounds f, s, and ch in certain phonological contexts. I'm not going to go into detail about what these phonological contexts exactly are, but the result is that we get from the West Germanic slapan, which is still reflected in English sleep, we get High German schlafen, or we get from the West Germanic water, we get High German Wasser. The T, intervocalic T, changes to an S sound. And we also get from West Germanic makon, we get to High German machen, so the shift from k to ch. Then a second set of shifts happens to the sounds p, t, k, and they turn into affricates. So from p, we get pf, as in Old English, which was not affected by this shift, we get the High German Apfel. Then the t sound changes to z, so that we have in German, in High German, we have Katze instead of cat in Old English, or cat in present-day English. And then the k changes to an affricate ch, which turns the Old English or West Germanic Makon into the High German machen. After that, what fills the now missing p, t, k slots are the originally voiced stops b, d, and g. So we have in West Germanic the word ribi for ribs turns into the High German Rippe with a p, with an unvoiced sound. The West Germanic word dag or dach changes to the High German equivalent tag with a t in the beginning. And similarly, the West Germanic the West Germanic word brugio changes to brücke, so g changes to k in this case. In English, there was another shift, a palatalization, which turned the g sound into j, bridge. And then as a fourth stage of this process, we also get the loss of the th sound, th, into d. So we have, instead of the West Germanic thornu, we had the High German dorn. Right. Okay. So these are the two basic phonological developments that happened and formed the languages that we now know as the Germanic languages. In particular, the second consonant shift can quite nicely illustrate how these change propagate throughout space. Because as I said, this shift is sometimes called the High German consonant shift, because it mostly affected the Upper German regions, those dark yellow, and Central German regions, the bright yellow. And Central and Upper German varieties are known as High German. So that's why High German consonant shift. And based on this shift, which in some areas happened, in other areas it didn't happen, we can see this continuum starting with the Upper German varieties on one end, where all of these shifts took place and on the other hand, on the other end of this continuum, we see languages such as Dutch, Frisian, Low German, English, which were not affected by this shift at all. This is also, for example, also in the Upper German regions. Not all regions were affected equally. So there are some varieties, for example, those Upper German varieties spoken in Switzerland, which were affected, for example, by the development of the affricates from k to k. This is something very typical for the Swiss varieties, but not for other varieties of Upper German. Okay. So, as I said, this shift, this second consonant shift, allows us to distinguish these different groups among the Germanic languages, and in particular, it created the language that is now spoken as the German, Standard German, which is based on the High German varieties, basically. Okay, so again, you can see an analogy with the first consonant shift, sort of phonologically creating creating the Germanic languages out of the Proto-Indo-European common ancestry. And here we see the second consonant shift creating the High German language out of all the other Germanic languages being spoken at that time. Okay, so now let's have a look at writing systems. So you probably know, and we've also discussed that one of the first ways how Germanic languages were written down were runes. The word alphabet is here in the plural because there was no one single standardized runic alphabet, but there were different runic alphabets which underwent several changes, and we know this from texts or inscriptions. The earliest that we know of come from approximately the 2nd century AD, and the last probably from the 15th century. There were also some runes being used in Norway in the 19th century or even beginning of the 20th century, but whether those runes are a continuation of these old runes beginning in the 2nd century is another question. It might be possible that those 19th century Norwegian runes are a different tradition. Nowadays, some runic symbols are still used are combined with Latin scripts, and we can, for example, find the letter thorn, this runic symbol, still used in Icelandic and Faroese. And you also know this symbol from when we learned how to use or how to read Old English. And Old English, even after the Christianization, still used another rune, the so-called Win rune, to represent the sound now represented by the W letter. Okay, then there was another alphabet that was used by very early on, which is the Gothic alphabet. This is based on the Greek alphabet and was used solely for Gothic. Then obviously we have the Latin alphabet, right? So the basic Latin Roman alphabet that you know, with certain special characters, sometimes with diacritics, can be or is used nowadays to write down the majority of Germanic languages. Now I said the majority because not all Germanic languages now spoken are written with the Latin alphabet. There is also one Germanic language which is written down using the Hebrew alphabet or an adapted version of the Hebrew alphabet, and that is Yiddish. So the difference between Hebrew and Yiddish orthography is that whereas Hebrew uses diacritics, the so-called nikud, to write vowels, Yiddish orthography uses only full letters to write vowels. And it is also in Yiddish that one of the most famous linguistic quotes has been written down that was in 1945 by Max Weinreich, who said, "A Sprach is a dialect mit an Armee und Flot." A language is a dialect with an army and navy. Sort of settling basically the discussion whether there are some linguistic properties that distinguish dialects from languages, and the meaning of this quote is no, there aren't. It's a political discussion, but that would be a topic for a different video. Okay, so as I said, the majority of the living Germanic languages uses the Latin alphabet, but there is this odd one out, Yiddish, that uses a different script. And it is also written and read from right to left and not from left to right. Okay, so here is just an example how the documents written in these 4 different alphabets look like. And we can move on to morphology. Okay, so the interesting thing about morphology and Germanic languages is that we can use morphology to distinguish between more analytic and more synthetic languages among the Germanic group. So on the one hand, we have languages such as English. We have all the English-based creoles, or Afrikaans, the Dutch-based language spoken in Namibia and South Africa. And those languages, the more analytic ones, they rely not so much on morphology. They don't have that many endings, not really that many prefixes, suffixes, and so forth, but they use more auxiliaries, more word order, and their word order, their syntax is also more fixed. Whereas on the other hand, we have languages such as Icelandic and Faroese, languages that rely on morphology to a very high degree. That in turn allows them to have their syntax more flexible, more free. And there, somewhere in between, is a group of languages such as German, Luxembourgish, and Yiddish that are still more synthetic than English, but not as Icelandic or Faroese. And again, more towards the analytic pole of this continuum would be the rest of these languages such as Dutch, Frisian, Low German, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. And if I speak about morphology, what I basically mean is, for example, nominal morphology, which means how many cases the language in question uses, just one case, 2 cases, 3 cases, 4 cases, how many different gender distinctions there are, 1, 2, or 3, and how many number categories the language uses. So 1 or 2 or more. If you remember, in Old English there was not only singular and plural, but also the third category of dual, which referred only to 2 items. There is also adjectival morphology, so how are adjectives and adjectival phrases marked morphologically. We know, for example, from languages such as German, Icelandic, or Faroese, we know that there are strong and weak inflections of adjectives. What's also interesting is to have a look at the pronominal morphology. So how are gender and politeness distinctions, for example, marked on pronouns? And lastly, verbal morphology, sort of how is morphology affecting the verbs of a language. So we know, for example, the distinction between weak and strong verbs, between different moods of verbs, subjunctive, imperative, and so forth. So based on these different categories, and probably also more, we can distinguish whether a language is more or less analytic or synthetic. Even though it doesn't mean that if a language in general tends to be more analytic, that it doesn't have any synthetic structures, and vice versa. It also doesn't mean that synthetic languages such as Icelandic or Faroese don't have analytic structures. They obviously have. It's just an overall tendency. Okay. And now, when we are talking about morphology in the Germanic languages, there's one thing that I would like to draw your attention to, and that is articles. This might seem like a very usual thing to have, that languages have articles, but in cross-linguistic comparison, this is in fact not that common. Not many languages use this system. But if we take a look at the present day currently spoken Germanic languages, we'll see that all of them have definite articles. This doesn't apply to older Germanic languages, because if you remember what we discussed in the first month or so, Old English, for example, didn't have articles. But nowadays, all Germanic languages have definite articles. On the other hand, not all of the Germanic languages have indefinite articles. There is one exception, and that is Icelandic, because Icelandic has definite articles, but no indefinite ones. Right. So we can probably, based on that, see that definite articles are first to develop, historically speaking, and indefinite articles only follow suit a bit later, which has not happened in Icelandic yet, at least. Okay, and then if we take a second look at the articles, not only whether a language has or has not articles, we might concentrate on the form of the articles. And we'll see that all West Germanic languages, so English, German, Yiddish, Luxembourgish, Dutch, Pennsylvanian Dutch, and so forth, all of those languages employ an analytic prenominal definite article, meaning the article comes before the noun and the article is a standalone word, right? Whereas all North Germanic languages do it differently, and they have a suffix, a postnominal suffix, something that you add to the word, to the base form of the word, of the noun, to signal that it is a definite reading of the word. So in West Germanic languages, we would have things like the house, das Haus, het Haus, das Haus. Whereas in North Germanic languages, we would find things like huset, husith, and similarly also for other nominal structures, right? Another thing is that there are different articles. The form of the articles is different based on the gender of the noun, and the number of gender categories in a language can differ. So there are languages such as English or Afrikaans which only have one article because there are no nominal gender categories. Then there are languages such as Dutch and Swedish and also others which only distinguish between two categories. And then there are languages such as German, Icelandic, and so forth, and those languages differentiate between three. So masculine, feminine, and neutral. Okay, so that was it about morphology, and now let's have a look at syntax. So I already hinted at this, but if we distinguish between more synthetic and more analytic Germanic languages, we can also see that this is reflected, at least to a certain degree, in the flexibility of syntax or of word order in these languages. And apart from that, there is an interesting phenomenon in the Germanic languages, not unique to the Germanic languages, but in Germanic languages it's quite interesting. It's the so-called V2. It's an abbreviation for verb second. And verb second means that the finite verb in mostly main clauses always has to occupy the second slot in the sentence. What do I mean? For example, in German, one would say something like, gestern bin ich erst 2 Uhr nach Hause gekommen. The finite form of the verb bin is here in the second position. Also, if I sort of change the sentence a bit, I'll get something similar. Ich bin gestern erst and so forth. Again, the finite form is in the second slot. A similar pattern can be seen in Dutch, for example, where we also have this with gisteren kwam ik pas 2 uur thuis. Again, so yesterday went I, and so forth. Also, Swedish uses the same thing. English, not. So yesterday I only got home at 2 o'clock. I only got home at 2 o'clock yesterday. So the finite form is not in the second position. And it's interesting to see that this was not always the case. English was probably never a real V2 language, because the distinction is a bit more complicated, and I'm not going to discuss the details, but it's not only V2 languages and non-V2 languages. There are also mixed languages in between, and sort of and different versions of V2 languages. But if we take a look at Old English, we would see that it was way closer to German as it is nowadays than to present-day English. So we have here, as an example, the following Old English sentence: Ontwam thingum hefde God thes mannes saule jedodot. In 2 things, or with 2 things, God had endowed man's soul. And you can see ontwam thingum, with 2 things, this is one phrase, so this counts as 1 slot. And the second one is the finite form of the verb. And as I said, the situation is more complicated if we take a look at other Germanic languages, because, for example, in German, if we take a look at how embedded clauses behave, we'll see that they have a different pattern, not V2, but the so-called Vfin, that the finite verb form is in the very last position, right? So we would in German have something like, hat mich gefragt, ob ich auch so müde bin, and the bin, the finite form, is at the very last position. Sometimes in German, in non-standard German, there is a different pattern known as V3, so the finite verb in the third position of the sentence. For example, ab jetzt kriege ich immer 20 Euro. Ab jetzt ich krieg immer 20 Euro. So that you have not ab jetzt kriege ich, but ab jetzt ich krieg. So V3. Okay. Now moving on to lexicon, this will be a very short chapter. One thing that's interesting if we compare the different Germanic languages is how they behave in terms of borrowing. How prone are they to borrow from other languages? And we can see that, for example, English very easily borrows from other languages. Whereas languages such as German or Icelandic, and perhaps Icelandic more than German, has rather the preference for word formation based on the native lexicon rather than borrowing loan words. And this might be sort of a feature of the language, but also it might be something that has to do with language policy of the community speaking the language, but nevertheless, it's there. And another aspect, if we talk about loan words, is the ease with which loan words can get integrated into the language system. And language system, that means phonological, orthographical, but also morphological. So how easily or how long does it take for a loan word to be to get native endings or to be orthographically adapted or also phonologically adapted, because different languages differ in how close they want the loan words to be pronounced to the original pronunciation, right? And we can see, for example, that if we compare Swedish and German, then German remains with its loan words very much close to the origin. So here, one example, delocation, right? Very close phonologically and orthographically, and also morphologically, right? If you look at the plural of location, to the English origin location. But take another loan word, also from English to Swedish, nörd, which is not really that close to nerd. I mean, phonologically, it's still close, but it's written differently, and it's also completely morphologically integrated. Okay, and now let's have a look at phonology. So what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to give you an overview of all the different phonological systems of the Germanic languages. That would be too much. But I'm going to have a look at one thing that two Germanic languages do extremely differently than the rest, and that is tonal differences, tones. Something that you probably know from languages such as Mandarin, Chinese, right? And this is not something that exists only outside of Europe. As I said, Swedish and Norwegian also uses this technique. So in those languages, or in Swedish and in Norwegian, there are more than 300 minimal pairs of words that are only distinguished in meaning by their tonal accent. And these languages have two accents, sometimes referred to as T1 and T2. The first one, T1, goes from low to high and then back to low. The T2 accent goes from high to low and then from high to low again. This can apply to monosyllabic, but just as well to polysyllabic words, right? So I can't really pronounce that correctly, but there is the difference in Norwegian between, or at least in certain varieties of Norwegian, between the pronunciation of the word bil with the first tone and with the second tone, and it can either mean car or axe. Similarly, the word uttale or something like that is either pronounced with the first tone and it means the verb to pronounce, or it can mean the noun pronunciation, right? Similarly, in Swedish, there is one example, for example, the word anden, which is anden and onden. One is duck, the other is spirit. Okay. So now we're on the summary slide. So we went through some of the things that distinguish Germanic languages from each other, but also from other non-Germanic languages. We have definitely not covered everything. But some of the important things that are interesting are, for example, historically speaking, the first and second consonant shift, then the different writing systems used to write down the languages. Then one of the morphological features are definite articles, right? And the distinction between definite articles as standalone prenominal words or as suffixes attached to the nouns. In terms of syntax, for example, one phenomena that we might look at is the so-called V2 word order. And when we talk about phonology, there is this really interesting thing going on in the north of the Scandinavian peninsula, and that is the tonal distinctions in Swedish and Norwegian. But as I said, there is more, there is way more. But for now, this is it. Thank you all for listening and for watching, and enjoy researching Germanic languages.